Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to cover chapter 32 of the book Learn Python the Hard Way, and we're going to cover loops and lists. So in the previous exercises we worked through if statements and we also learned about elif and else. And today we're going to build on top of that and learn about how to work with loops to iterate over certain entries and also how to work with lists with multiple entries. And specifically, we're going to learn about for loops and how to loop over entries in a list using a for loop. So first of all, here's some instruction on how we can create new lists by simply typing out the name of the list and then assigning this entry to it. So on the right side, we have those brackets, and inside, separated by comma, we have the different entries for the different lists. So if we want to do that, for example, in the Python interpreter, we can open our terminal window here and then type in Python 3. And here we can, for example, define a new list with the values brown, blonde, and red. And if we then access that, we can see that this variable hairs is indeed a list with 3 different entries. And of course, we can also have other entries in there. So for example, eyes with the values brown, blue, and green. And these are strings, of course. And again, we can easily access that. But it's of course also possible to have other values inside of our lists. For example, integers. And just in the same way, we can then basically print out the content. So in general, when we want to create a list, then we would start by opening those left brackets here, then entering the different entries for our list, separated by a comma, and then we're closing it with another bracket here on the right side. Now with that out of the way, let's get started with actually typing out this exercise here, which uses lists and also for loops to iterate through those different entries within those lists. So as always, we're going to switch over to our terminal, and from here we can then open a new Python file. I'm going to use Visual Studio Code, which I installed. So to do that, to open a new file, we can just type out code followed by the name of the Python file. So in this case, exercise 32.py. In this newly opened file, we can then type out the variable here. So first of all, we have a list with 5 entries. Next, we have a fruits list, which has different strings inside of it. So apples, oranges, pears, and apricots. And finally, we have a list which contains both numbers and also strings. Let's add a comment here. So here we now for the first time see a for loop. So we type out for number in the name of the list. So in this case, the count, colon. Then we have 4 spaces and we print using printf in this case. This is count. And then we enter the name of the variable. So number. So what we do here is we have the list name and we go through each entry within the list using this variable here up front. So we say for the number in the count, print this. And so what happens here for each entry in our list, we iterate over that, and that would be assigned to number. So in the first iteration, number is equal to 1, then number is equal to 2, number is equal to 3, 4, and then 5. And each time we go through one of these entries, we basically print out the statement here. And of course, number would always be updated to represent the respective entry in our list. So we would print out this is count 1, this is count 2, this is count 3, and so on and so forth until we went through all the elements in the list. We can do that, take that same approach for the other list. The only difference here is that now with fruits, if you take a look at that, those are strings as opposed to numbers that we are printing out. But other than that, it works exactly the same way. So here again, just as we did before with number, we are now defining a new variable fruit, which refers to each of those entries in the list. And then in each iteration, fruit would basically be replaced with the appropriate entry in our list, and that would be printed out. So we would print out a fruit of type, and then apples, a fruit of type oranges, and so on and so forth until we go through the entire list. But it's also possible to go through mixed lists, which contain both numbers, integers, but also strings. So here we say for I in change, and note that change contains both numbers but also strings. We print out using printf I got, and then I, and then we can print out those entries here. So in the first iteration, it's gonna say I got 1, then I got pennies, I got 2, I got dimes, and so on and so forth. And if we have a number here, then that will automatically be turned into a string by the print function here, so that it is a valid input and can be used. We can also build lists, and in that case we would first of all start with an empty list. And to do that, all we need to do is to basically define the name of the list and then assign those brackets to it. So now we have an empty list called elements. And now we want to add some values to our elements list. So in this case, we are going to use the range function, and we are going to add to it the numbers 0 through 5. So here we're going to say for I, and of course we could, instead of I, we could name it any way. For example, here we used fruit or number, so I is really arbitrary. For in range 0 through 6, and if you think back about the previous exercise, we know that the first value in range is inclusive, so it would be included, and the second value is exclusive, so if we type range from 0 to 6, it would actually print out the numbers 0 through 5, and 6 is excluded. And now we're going to print out using printf, adding, and then the variable name, I to the list. And now we're going to use a specific function here. We're going to call append on elements, and we are going to append that value here. So that basically means that when we go through each iteration, we're going to print out adding, for example, 0 to the list, adding 1 to the list, and so on and so forth. And we also add that value, so 0, 1, all the way through 5, to the elements list. So the elements list will always grow on each iteration, and at the end we're going to have all the values from 0 through 5 added to elements. And then afterwards we can of course print those values out. So now we can say for I in elements, we're going to go ahead using printf to print out the values here. Alright, so let's save that real quick. And now we can open the terminal and type in Python 3 followed by the name of the Python file, and now we can compare our output to the output in the solution. So first of all we get this is count 1, so on and so forth up until count 5, which is exactly what we do here first, because we iterate over the different entries in the count list, and as we do so we print out this is count and then the number. So this is count 1, this is count 2, all the way up to 5. Next we iterate over the fruits list, and we print out each fruit, apples, oranges, pears, apricot. And what we do here is we print out a fruit of type colon and then the name of the fruit. And exactly those entries are printed out here. After that, we do the same, but this time for a mixed list, which includes both numbers and strings. So here we get back, I got 1, I got pennies, I got 2, which are exactly those values here, and so on and so forth. And then finally, we have a new list elements that we defined, and we use the range function here to add the values 0 through 5 to elements. And as we were doing that, we always printed out I got 0 to the, adding 0 to the list, adding 1 to the list up until 5. So this happens here when we actually create our list. And then next we iterate over the elements in the list and we print out element was, and now we print out the elements 0 through 5 that we added before. So that's basically how we can use lists and how we can use the for loop to iterate over those lists, for example, to print out the values in the list. Let's take a look at the study drills section here. So the first exercise here is to take a look at how we used range and to look up the range function to understand it. So if we take a look at how we used range in here, we can see that we set for I in range 0 through 5, so 0, 6, and 6 is exclusive. 0 is inclusive, and then we basically iterated over that, and in this case printed it out and added those elements to the empty list. Now if we take a look at the Python documentation, we can see a list of all the different built-in functions, including our range function. And if we take a look at that, we can see we have here the start value that we provide and then the stop value that we provide. And optionally, we could also add a step. So if you want to increment those in steps of 1, which is the default, or what we could also do is we could, for example, say we want to increment that in steps of 2, for example, and then we wouldn't go from 0 all the way to 5, but it would basically be 0 and then not 1, but 0, 2, 4. Those would be the values. So we could adjust that. And here we could take a closer look following that link to get a better understanding of ranges. And here we see some examples of how to use such a range by defining a start and a stop value. And then we can basically iterate over those steps. Next question is, could we have avoided that for loop in line 22, this one here, and just assigned range 0 through 6 directly to elements? So we defined that empty list elements, and then what we did here is we iterated over the range 0 through 6, and we basically added each of those values to elements. And then after that, we printed out the elements. And that, of course, are a couple of steps. It's quite a bit of code just to add those elements in here. And of course, we could do that by hand. So we could do this here, 0, 1, 3, 4, and 5. But of course, especially if you have a very large range of entries, maybe 1,000 entries in our list, then that would not be a good solution. In that case, we can actually do the following. We can use range 0 through 6. So exactly what we are doing here, but that's not enough because this will basically give us back a range object and we still need to convert that to a list. So we need to say list and then pass that in here. And this way we can basically get rid of this section here. Let's just comment it out. And we should still be able to basically print out the values here. So let's check that. And here at the end, we can still get elements was 0 all the way up to 5. So that's still working. Just to give that a little bit more context, let's switch over to our Python interpreter by opening our terminal and typing in Python 3 and pressing enter. And if, for example, we do the following, we have the elements variable. And let's say, first of all, we just want to assign range 0 through 6 to it. If we do that and we take a look at what's inside elements, we can see it literally put range 0 through 6 in there, which is of course not what we want. We want to turn that into a list. So in order to do that, we would actually have to do list and then pass range 0 through 6 to it. And now if we take a look at elements, we get exactly what we want, the values 0 through 5. And finally, find the Python documentation on lists and read about them. What other operations can you do to lists beside append? So we had append here. Let's just uncomment that again. We can see here that we called append on elements and we passed the value in the range to it. If we take a look at our Python documentation, we can see there are actually a number of functions that we can call on lists. We find append here, but for example also extend, which extends a list by appending all the items from the iterable, or we can do insert to insert a certain value at a certain place in our list, or we can also remove some values. So if we, instead of adding some values using append, we want to remove some values, we could do that. Or we could also use pop, which gives us back basically the last value in our list. So there are a number of different handy functions that we could access or use with our lists. And finally, let's take a look at some common student questions. First of all, how do we make a two-dimensional list? So a two-dimensional list would basically be what we see here, where we see we have inside of a list, we have two lists included. So if we compare that to our list up here, that would be a one-dimensional list because we just have those values in here surrounded by those brackets. But we can create a two-dimensional list by just basically using brackets, and then inside of those we can add the lists themselves, and that would also be possible. Aren't lists and arrays the same thing? So that really depends on the language and the implementation. In many other languages we are working with arrays, but in Python this is called a list. So in classic terms, a list is very different from an array because of how they're implemented in Ruby, another programming language, though they call these arrays. In Python, they call them lists. Just call these lists for now, since that's what Python calls them. So we're going to focus on the term lists when we work with them. But arrays are a similar concept. Why is a for loop able to use a variable that isn't defined yet? So here, for example, if you take a look at that for number in the count, we never defined number before, we just added in here in the for statement for the first time. So the variable is defined by the for loop when it starts, initializing it to the current element of the loop iteration each time through. So basically, when we define it this way, when we set up our for loop, then number would automatically be defined and would be set to the first entry of our list, and then of course always refer to the next element in the list. Why does for I in range 1, 3 only loop 2 times instead of 3 times? So we saw that here, for example, I in range 0, 6, we looped through the values 0 through 5, but 6 is not included. And that's because the range function only includes the first of the arguments here, and the second one is exclusive, so it does not include the last step, but stops basically right before it. And therefore, if we have range 1 through 3, we would actually just get the values 1 and 2, but since 3 is exclusive, it would not be part of that range. And finally, what does elements.append do, which we see down here? So that simply appends to the end of the list that we have. So we can open up a Python shell and try a few examples with the list that we make. Anytime we run into things like that, we should always try to play with them interactively in the Python shell. So let's do that. Let's open up the Python interpreter. And let's say we have a list called elements, 1, 2, 3. And we type it out, then we see we have those elements. Now if you want to append another value, we say elements.append, and we insert the value that we want to append, so 4 for example. And now if we take a look at elements again, we have those values 1 through 4, so it's an easy way to add an element at the end of our list. So that's it for exercise 32, and see you guys in the next video with exercise 33.